An Introduction to Ouroboros Egoism, written by Felipe Bautista. I have no reason to suppose that if I were to swap bodies right now with a butterfly, I'd encounter sensible representations, that is, Vorstellungen, or even more precisely, Wahrnehmungen, Erscheinungen, in my now newly acquired butterfly sensible intuition, similar in quality to those I encounter in the context of human sensible intuition. What I perceive and identify as the moon, for example, that luminous round disk that graces the night sky and that inspires man with its apparent luminosity, may look entirely different when seen through butterfly eyes. Perhaps, if I swap bodies with a butterfly, I'll no longer see a round disk, but a shape entirely different than the one that arises in human sensible intuition. I'll perceive colors entirely different than those that arise in human sensible intuition. I'll perceive geometrical patterns entirely different than those that arise in human sensible intuition, etc. Viz., that object called the moon, that appears to human sensible intuition as a luminous round disk, would likely manifest entirely differently through butterfly sensory systems. The moon that appears to human sensible intuition as a luminous round disk might manifest to butterfly sensible intuition as an entirely different configuration of sensory data. Now, though I have no reason to suppose that sensible representations arising in the context of butterfly sensible intuition bear any resemblance whatsoever to the sensible representations arising in the context of human sensible intuition, as we've seen, I do have reason to suppose that sensible representations arising in the context of butterfly sensible intuition bear no resemblance whatsoever to the sensible representations arising in the context of human sensible intuition, given the fact of the great differences between butterfly and human eyes, the great differences between butterfly and human sense organs, and the great differences between butterfly and human cognitive sensory systems, more generally speaking. It is a question of fact, remarked David Hume in his inquiry concerning human understanding, whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here, experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is therefore without any foundation in reasoning. Interestingly, immediately before Hume, in his aforesaid first inquiry, so remarked, he also raised the following question: by what argument can it be proved that the perceptions of the mind must be caused by 1. External objects, entirely different from them, though resembling them, if that be possible, and could not arise either from 2. The energy of the mind itself, or from 3. The suggestion of some invisible and unknown spirit, or from 4. Some other cause still more unknown to us. By the time he wrote his first critique, Kant too was already remarking that appearances are to be regarded as being one and all representations only, not things in themselves, and that time and space are therefore only sensible forms of our intuition, not determinations given as existing by themselves, nor conditions of objects viewed as things in themselves. What I am trying to say is that I cannot even pronounce with apodeictic certainty that anything that appears to me in sensible intuition, whether butterflies, the moon, men, etc., has any objective validity, that is, existence, independent of the field of my sensible intuition. I naturally believe that the moon will not cease to exist as a round sphere when I am no longer perceiving it. And I naturally believe that the butterflies and men I perceive will continue to exist even after they are no longer present to my sensibility. But if it is the case that appearances, including eo ipso butterflies, the moon, and men, are to be regarded as being, one and all, representations only, not things in themselves, And if it is the case that the mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects, then I eo ipso simply beg the question when I assume that metaphysical solipsism is not the case. That is, when I assume that the sole reality is not myself, as a mind entertaining itself with its own representations. To begin with the senses, tells us David Hume in his seminal treatise of human nature, "'Tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects, e.g., the moon, butterflies, men, etc., after they no longer appear to the senses. For that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate even after they have ceased all manner of operation. Nor can I say that what I perceive as butterflies and men, respectively, continue to exist when I am no longer perceiving them on the basis that they are still conscious of themselves, though I am no longer perceiving them. Because this is to specifically beg the question, and suppose that just because I think of some of my representations as conscious agents, they eo ipso are conscious agents. It does not follow that X is the case, because I think that X is the case. After all, it is logically possible that metaphysical solipsism is actually the case, such that nothing at all exists save myself as a mind entertaining itself with these representations. Of course, I am not endorsing metaphysical solipsism at all, nor am I saying that metaphysical solipsism actually is the case. Rather, I am only pointing out that it is logically possible that metaphysical solipsism actually may be the case. Why do I point out the logical possibility of metaphysical solipsism? Because I want to bring awareness to the fact that, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects after they no longer appear to the senses. For that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate even after they have ceased all manner of operation. My aim is to cultivate an intimate awareness of the mental nature of the phenomenal world perceived. It is very common to think that the houses, mountains, and rivers that arise in my sensible intuition remain in existence even when I am no longer perceiving them. Yet, to once again cite Hume's treatise, that our senses offer not their impressions as the images of something distinct or independent and external is evident, because they convey to us nothing but a single perception and never give us the least intimation of anything beyond. A single perception can never produce the idea of a double existence, but by some inference, either of the reason or imagination. When the mind looks farther than what immediately appears to it, its conclusions can never be put to the account of the senses, and it certainly looks farther when, from a single perception, it infers a double existence and supposes the relations of resemblance and causation betwixt them. I previously published an essay on the evolution of the philosopher. The philosopher begins his journey in dogmatism, naively attempting to provide a description of reality as it is independent of his sensible intuition. He then proceeds on to skepticism, when he finally finds the strength to put aside his prejudices and concede that the senses convey to us nothing but a single perception and never give us the least intimation of anything beyond. And finally he graduates to criticism, at which point he entirely abandons the transcendental realist criterion of truth altogether. That is, at which point he is no longer concerned with whether his representations correspond to transcendent things in themselves, because he concedes that he simply can have no access at all to alleged transcendent things in themselves. See Kant's Critique of the Fourth Paralogism for a more thorough account of the transcendental realist criterion of truth and how it differs from the empirical realist criterion of truth. The philosopher is childishly catching at bubbles when he is in the dogmatic and skeptical stages of his philosophizing. Why? Because he is concerning himself with what he cannot ever possibly have access to. Namely, he is concerning himself with what, if anything, exists independent of his sensible intuition, independent of the theater of his mind. Hence, the dogmatist fantasizes about how the objects of the senses continue to exist even after they no longer appear to the senses, naive, dogmatic, transcendental realism. Or he fantasizes about some mind at large which dissociates into alters, dogmatic idealism. The skeptic, too, like the dogmatist, philosophizes in terms of transcendental reality, that is, in terms of what, if anything, exists independent of his sensible intuition, independent of the theater of his mind. But unlike the dogmatist, who, like a child captivated by bubbles moving in the air, entertains himself with his own fantasies about the objects of the senses continuing to exist after they no longer appear to the senses, or with fantasies about some mind at large, the skeptic, even though he does philosophize in terms of transcendental reality, calls into question the possibility of knowledge, because his representations may not at all correspond to things in themselves. After all, as the skeptic concedes, a malicious demon may be at work behind the scenes. In turn, the critical philosopher, unlike the dogmatic and skeptic philosophers respectively, does not philosophize in terms of transcendental reality. For the critical philosopher, what is of importance is studying the mind from within, without worrying about what, if anything, there is external to the mind itself. The critical philosopher, of course, does not endorse metaphysical solipsism. The critical philosopher is aware of the fact that, just like naive transcendental realism and dogmatic idealism, metaphysical solipsism is a dogmatic position about transcendental reality. In the case of metaphysical solipsism, transcendental reality is denied existence to core. The critical philosopher does not say that there is a transcendental reality beyond his sensible intuition, nor does he say that there is no transcendental reality beyond his sensible intuition. He only acknowledges that he cannot have knowledge concerning this issue either way, and he therefore commits himself to studying the mind itself, from within the mind itself, as it is instantiated, and without speculating about anything beyond the architecture of the mind itself. I want now to introduce what I desire to call Ouroboros egoism. What is Ouroboros egoism? Firstly, it should be noted that the term egoism is perfectly synonymous with the term solipsism, so that when I say egoism, it may rightfully be supposed that I am saying solipsism. However, I desire here to distinguish between two types of egoism, that is, between two types of solipsism, namely dogmatic and transcendental. Dogmatic egoism is a metaphysical position, according to which all that exists is myself. In turn, transcendental egoism is a critical position, according to which, whether other minds exist or no, minds cannot in principle have any access either to each other or to things in themselves, because minds in principle can have access only to their own immanent representations, Vorstellungen. Ouroboros egoism presupposes transcendental egoism, but goes a bit further. How so? According to Ouroboros egoism, not only is it the case that, whether other minds exist or no, minds cannot in principle have any access either to each other or to things in themselves, because minds in principle can have access only to their own immanent representations, Vorstellungen. But it is also the case that I myself am a mind. In other words, Ouroboros egoism rejects a duality between self and mind. Ouroboros egoism rejects the view that I am a self with a mind. According to Ouroboros egoism, I don't have a mind. Rather, according to Ouroboros egoism, I am a mind. Furthermore, a mind ouroborically interacting with its own immanent representations. Is Ouroboros egoism compatible with metaphysical solipsism? Yes, it is. Since Ouroboros egoism, And the transcendental egoism it presupposes begins with the proposition that, whether other minds exist or no, minds cannot in principle have any access either to each other or to things in themselves, because minds in principle can have access only to their own immanent representations, Vorstellungen. Emphasis here on whether other minds exist or no. Yet, Ouroboros egoism is not at all a metaphysical position, such that the question of whether other minds exist or no is strictly irrelevant in the context of Ouroboros egoism. Ouroboros egoism specifically involves no transcendent metaphysical speculation of any variety whatsoever, and is a philosophy of the mind, by the mind, strictly immanent. According to Ouroboros egoism, then, when I look up at the moon, I am a mind ouroborically interacting with itself. When I brew a cup of tea, I am a mind ouroborically interacting with itself. When I climb a mountain, I am a mind ouroborically interacting with itself. When I have a conversation with a fellow man, I am a mind ouroborically interacting with itself. When I philosophize about whether or not there are things in themselves, other minds, or some mind at large beyond my own sphere of representations, I am a mind ouroborically interacting with itself. When I do anything at all, that is, I am a mind simply interacting ouroborically with itself, with its own immanent representations. All bodies, together with the space in which they are, must be considered nothing but mere representations in us, and exist nowhere but in our thoughts, tells us Kant in his Prolegomena. Additionally, according to Ouroboros egoism, the moon I perceive is no further away from me than my own body. Both are equally representations in me. Of course, several questions now arise. For example, the question of whether a past and future exist, or whether only the present now of consciousness exists. Another question that arises is the question of volition, the question of why I seem to have control over some representations in me, my body, but not others, mountains, the moon, butterflies, the weather, etc. In response to the former question, we may say that, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects, after they no longer appear to the senses. For that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate, even after they have ceased all manner of operation. And in response to the latter question, we must acknowledge the possibility of a given manifold, that is, the possibility that the matter of experience is given to, rather than created by the mind, such that things in themselves, the suggestion of some invisible and unknown spirit, C.F. Berkeley, or some other cause still more unknown, possibly do affect the sensibility, rather than the matter of experience, being entirely created by the energy of the mind itself. Although, in response to the latter question, we must also acknowledge the possibility that the matter of experience is created by the energy of the mind itself, and, just like even in dreams, I seemingly do not have control over everything in the dream, even though I am creating, and even am, the whole dream itself. I seemingly do not have control over everything in experience, even though I am creating, and, in fact, am, the whole of what I call experience. In dreams, we simultaneously create and experience a world that often resists our conscious control. Dream objects and characters display autonomy despite existing nowhere but in the dreamer's consciousness. This provides a powerful model for understanding how, within Ouroboros egoism, the apparent independence of objects from our will need not imply their existence outside consciousness. The resistance of representation to volition, the fact that mountains do not move at my command while my arm does, might reflect differentiation within the structure of consciousness itself, rather than evidence for mind-independent reality. Anyways, Ouroboros egoism is an immanent critical stance, meaning that it is all about how the mind engages with its own representations and is not at all concerned with transcendent speculation to begin with. And furthermore, for how seemingly independent of my will other men, the weather or mountains, appear to be, for all that, it is perfectly logically possible that I may suddenly awaken to discover that I am a butterfly, or some other creature totally different, who was only dreaming of being a man. Cf. Zhuangzi. Furthermore, a butterfly that lives in a world where neither mankind nor even the planet Earth ever arose. Ouroboros egoism, it should be noted, is perfectly compatible with upholding the regulative validity of the idea of other minds on the basis of practical reason, such that the Ouroboros egoist philosopher need not succumb to pathological solipsism. Namely, the Ouroboros egoist can still function morally as if there are other minds, even if he is aware that he is only interacting with himself, and even if he is aware that he cannot possibly know whether metaphysical solipsism is the case or not. Furthermore, Ouroboros egoism involves its own unique ethical dimension, because when one acknowledges that one only interacts with oneself, viz., Ouroboros egoism, then the saying, "With what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again," takes on a radically profound and actually literal significance. This perspective transcends both consequentialist and deontological ethical frameworks by grounding ethics in the very structure of consciousness, rather than in external consequences or abstract principles. The ethical imperative emerges from the recognition that all apparent otherness exists within the domain of one's own consciousness, or, more specifically, as oneself. Oneself, that is, as a mind ouroborically interacting with its own representations. This does not reduce ethics to self-interest in the conventional sense, as the self here is not the empirical ego, but consciousness, or the mind, in its ouroboric self-interactive totality. Rather than diminishing ethical responsibility, this recognition deepens it by revealing how harm directed toward apparent others is harm within the totality of one's own conscious experience. That is, harm to others rather literally, in the context of Ouroboros egoism, is harm to oneself. As wrote that legendary sage of Königsberg, "Even if we could bring our intuition to the highest degree of clearness, we should not thereby come any nearer to the constitution of objects in themselves. We should still know only our mode of intuition, that is, our sensibility. We should, indeed, know it completely, but always only under the conditions of space and time, conditions which are originally inherent in the subject. What the objects may be in themselves would never become known to us even through the most enlightened knowledge of that which is alone given us, namely, their appearance.